a 47-year-old woman stepped onto the stage in an out-of-fashion floral dress and an awkward smile. The entire hall chuckled quietly, the judges raised their eyebrows, and the audience braced themselves for a performance to forget. But then, she began to sing, and all of Britain fell silent. Before we begin, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from around the world, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next story. In the small town of West Lothian, Scotland, on a drizzly Saturday afternoon in March, rain gently fell on old tiled roofs. In a gray brick house at the end of a quiet street, 47-year-old Susan Boyle was flipping through old newspapers, searching for crossword puzzles, a habit that helped her pass time and soothe the loneliness that had stretched across decades. The grandfather clock chimed from the living room, reminding her it was time to prepare dinner. But instead of standing up, Susan glanced out the window where soaked tree branches swayed in the wind, much like her soul, aged, lonely, and with no one left to hear her sing. She used to sing a lot, in church, in the bathroom, at family gatherings when her mother was still alive. But since her mother passed, the house had become hauntingly silent. Bridget Boyle was the only one who ever believed in Susan's voice. And now, there was no one left who did. "Your voice is very expressive," her high school music teacher had once said, but then followed with a cold remark, "Still, it's just a hobby, not a realistic career path." That statement was like a dagger. It followed Susan throughout her youth. Mocked by classmates for her awkward walk, her naturally frizzy hair, and her strange way of speaking, Susan gradually withdrew into her own world. Quiet, safe, but without a stage, without lights, without an audience. Until one day, an elderly neighbor named Mrs. Carney, after accidentally hearing Susan sing Ave Maria in the backyard, said, "You should audition for Britain's Got Talent. You're not young anymore, but there's something in your voice that brought me to tears. Not the technique, the emotion." Susan burst out laughing. Not a laugh of belief, but one tinged with bitterness. "Do you even know how old I am? Age doesn't stop pain, and it doesn't stop sincerity, Mrs. Kearney replied curtly. That night, sitting alone with a cup of cold tea and her old organ, Susan pulled up a YouTube video of a young contestant performing "I Dreamed a Dream." A flicker of light passed through her eyes, not because of the stage presence, but because that song was once a whisper she'd sing every night when her mother was still alive. I dreamed a dream in time gone by. A dream I no longer dare to dream. She burst into tears, but it wasn't the old pain. It was something shifting inside her, a sense of incompletion, of a life not yet fully lived. The next morning, Susan stepped out of her house, holding an envelope with shaky handwriting that read, "Application, BGT." She didn't even dare to hope, she just wanted to see if maybe, somewhere, the dream was still waiting to be found again. The city of Manchester had never been this crowded. Hundreds of people lined up outside the Palace Theatre, dressed in glamorous outfits, carrying props, portfolios, or name placards. Some danced hip-hop on the sidewalk to warm up the stage, others practiced vocal runs or live-streamed on social media. Amid the crowd stood a middle-aged woman in a beige floral dress, slightly messy hair, and a gray knitted coat, all alone. Susan Boyle, 47 years old. No social media account, no manager, no companion. Just a small canvas bag, a pair of worn-down leather shoes, and a printed copy of the lyrics to I Dreamed a Dream. The girl at the registration desk glanced at the form, then looked up, momentarily surprised. "Oh, you'll be performing solo?" Susan nodded, trying to keep a smile. "I sing better than I talk." The girl smiled politely, "Good luck," and then turned to the next person in line. In the waiting room, Susan sat, dwarfed by groups of young, energetic contestants. A few turned to look at her and whispered something. A young duet even giggled. What's she doing here? Maybe she's lost? Or just wants to be on television for fun? Susan heard it all, but she didn't respond. Not because it hurt, she had heard such things all her life. Those whispers had once made her cry in high school bathrooms, had kept her from every audition, had crushed the dreams of a girl who once believed in beautiful things. But today, she wouldn't let them stop her. An assistant stepped in and called her name. "Susan Boyle, ready?" Susan took a deep breath. Her heart beat fast, but not frantically. She tightened her grip on her coat sleeve, stood up, and followed the staff member. Backstage, the clacking of heels from production crew echoed like the score of a suspenseful movie. The muffled background music, the roar of applause from the stage ahead, everything surged around her. A female staffer gave her a sympathetic look. "Stage is to the right. Remember to keep the mic close to your mouth." Susan nodded faintly, but her eyes searched the room as if looking for someone. In her mind, her mother's voice rang out startlingly clear. "You can do anything if you dare to step forward." As the MC announced, "Next, we have a contestant from West Lothian, Scotland, Susan Boyle." Susan stepped out. The blinding spotlight hit her eyes, making her blink. She heard a few stifled chuckles. The auditorium was packed. Many people raised their eyebrows at the sight of her, seemingly out of place in this dazzling, colorful space. Judge Simon Cowell tilted his head, squinting. Amanda Holden looked at the form and smiled professionally. Piers Morgan rested his chin on his hand, as if anticipating a cringe-worthy moment. Simon asked, "What's your name?" "Susan Boyle." "And what will you be singing?" "I Dreamed a Dream," from Les Miserables. "I see. Why did you choose that song?" Susan gave a soft smile. "Because it used to be my dream, and I want to see if it's still alive." A few laughs erupted from the audience. Susan didn't mind. As the instrumental intro began, she gently closed her eyes. A brief moment as if the world went silent. She saw her mother, saw her 16-year-old self standing in the living room, saw those quiet afternoons spent singing alone, saw the dream tucked away for 30 years. And then she sang, "I dreamed a dream in time gone by." Her voice rang out smooth, powerful, and full of weight. No laughter, no mockery. Only a different kind of silence, one of intent listening. Just a few lines in, Simon looked up. Piers furrowed his brows. Amanda leaned forward, her eyes beginning to shimmer. "I dreamed a dream in time gone by." Susan Boyle's voice cut through skepticism, transcending the boundaries of age, appearance, and prejudice. Within the first few seconds, the air of sarcasm and shallowness in the audience vanished, replaced by a tense, absolute silence, tight as a drawn string. The stage lights reflected off her silvery gray hair, illuminating her half-closed eyes as she immersed herself in every lyric. No more laughter, no more whispers, only music and truth. Susan sang with everything she had ever lived through. A forgotten dream, a quiet youth, a love never named, and a deep, unbitter loneliness. Midway through the song, the camera panned to the audience. Someone had a hand over their mouth. Another slowly nodded. A teenage girl was silently crying. In the control room, the director whispered, "Hold the shot. Don't cut. Don't ruin the magic." At the judges' table, Amanda Holden had tears streaming down her face before she even realized. She didn't try to hide it. Susan's voice wasn't perfect in a technical or academic sense, but there was something about it that made listeners feel they were standing face to face with a real person. No pretense, no performance, just pure honesty. But the tigers come at night. Susan opened her eyes for the climax. Her voice rang out powerful and clear. The timid expression from earlier had vanished. She no longer cared what anyone thought. She was telling her life story through every lyric, every breath. As they tear your hope apart, an older man in the audience stood up, tears in his eyes. He began clapping gently in rhythm, a gesture far from stage protocol, but filled with rare sincerity. When Susan sang the final line, "Now life has killed the dream I dreamed," a pause lingered in the air. 1 second, 2, then 3, and then the hall erupted in applause. The ovation thundered, followed by cheers, whistles, and then people rising to their feet. One stood, then another, until nearly the entire auditorium had risen for the woman they had so wrongly judged at first glance. Susan stood still. Her face trembled slightly, not from fear, but from disbelief that she was truly being heard. She bowed her head slightly, her eyes wet but shining brighter than they had in years. Judge Piers Morgan was the first to break the silence. "I haven't been this shocked in a long time doing this show." Ober. Simon Cowell, known for his stern and emotionless critiques, spoke slowly, clearly. "When you said you wanted to be a professional singer, I thought we were about to see a joke. But what I just heard was one of the most remarkable performances I've ever witnessed here." Susan just smiled a little shy, a little unsure. "Thank you." Amanda dabbed her eyes with a tissue and said, "You just made the entire country stop and listen. I don't think anyone cares how old you are or what you wore. All they'll remember is that voice." As Susan left the stage, several other contestants backstage stood aside to let her pass. A few patted her shoulder. Someone whispered, "You were incredible." One of the camera crew quietly spoke into his headset. This is a historic moment in television. Back in the dressing room, Susan sat down in front of the mirror. For the first time in her life, she didn't see an older, out-of-place woman. She saw an artist who had just stepped out of the shadow of years of being underestimated. The next morning, as sunlight streamed through the small window of her home in West Lothian, Susan Boyle's landline phone began ringing for the 10th time in less than an hour. She sat in her armchair, holding a cup of cold tea, staring blankly at the television screen. On it was her own face, singing "I Dreamed a Dream," with the headline running below, "Susan Boyle Phenomenon, the woman who left Britain speechless." Her performance video had been uploaded to YouTube in the early hours of the morning. Within just a few hours, it had already surpassed 2 million views. The television reporter spoke in an excited voice. Modest appearance, no makeup, awkward speech, but then Susan Boyle began to sing, and all of Britain fell silent. Experts are calling this the most authentic and moving moment in television in the past 10 years. Susan looked at the screen in disbelief. She had been used to living in silence in a small home where everything remained in its usual place. She had never used email, never live-streamed, and didn't even know how to create a social media account. And yet now, people were calling her a phenomenon. Within just 48 hours, Susan's schedule was completely packed. Calls from the BBC, from ITV, from major newspapers like The Guardian, The Times, The New York Times. Everyone wanted to interview the woman who had shocked Simon Cowell and made Amanda Holden cry on live television. A young reporter from the local television station knocked on her door with a film crew, asking to shoot a typical day in the life of Susan Boyle. Susan, flustered, could only smile and invite them in, saying, "Watch out for the doormat, it's slippery." In no des, they filmed her making tea, feeding the cat, wiping windows, and later singing a short excerpt of "Cry Me a River" in the living room. The camera captured every clumsy movement, every wrinkle around her eyes, every honest glance. No staging, no dazzling lights, just the truth. And that was exactly what made people love Susan. But not everything that came with fame was pleasant. Just days later, tabloid newspapers began publishing old photos of her from a time when she was heavier, more unkempt. They ran headlines like, "An angelic voice in the body of your nosy neighbor, a fairy tale, or a television gimmick." Susan didn't read the papers, but the whispers from acquaintances, the strange looks from strangers when she bought bread, were enough to unsettle her. At times, she locked the doors, turned off the phone, and sat alone in her room, playing old tapes her mother had recorded. On them, her 25-year-old voice rang out youthful and full of hope. Susan hugged her knees, softly murmuring, "Mum, is all this going too fast?" She wasn't afraid of fame. She was afraid it would disappear, and that she'd return to the silence she once knew. But this time, the silence would hurt more because she had tasted the light. That night, when she opened the mailbox, she found a postcard from a complete stranger. On it were the words, "I'm a 53-year-old single mother. I stopped dreaming a long time ago until I heard you sing. Thank you for giving me the courage to find myself again." Susan clutched the card in her hands, sat in silence for a while, and then cried. Not out of sadness, but because, for the first time in her life, she felt she truly mattered to someone. The next day, Simon Cowell called. "Susan, I've just received offers from 3 major record labels. They want to sign you, even before the finals happen. But I'm just an ordinary woman. That's exactly why they want you, because you're unlike anyone else." Susan looked out the window at the sunlight falling on the rose garden her mother once tended. She smiled softly and said, "If I agree, I want to do it my way. No changing my voice, no new hair, no heavy makeup. I am who I am." End of 20. Simon paused for a second, then said, "Then the dream has already begun." The grand finale of Britain's Got Talent took place at the Hammersmith Apollo Theatre in London. The media called it the most anticipated night in the show's history. Tickets sold out in under 10 minutes. Over 15 million people were expected to watch the live broadcast. Backstage, contestants bustled about, some warming up their vocals, others fixing their dance shoes, some live streaming to fans. Susan Boyle sat quietly in a corner, clutching a worn stack of lyrics sheets. On the front page, she had written in blue ink, "Not to win, but to live just once, truly." The stage lights glowed brightly. Her name was clearly listed on the program. Susan Boyle, I Dreamed a Dream. Like a full-circle moment, she chose the song that had first brought her into the light, not because she lacked other options, but because she wanted to affirm herself one more time. When it was her turn, Susan stood up, adjusted her dress, and took a deep breath. An assistant handed her a microphone and gently asked, "Are you ready?" "I've never truly been ready," Susan smiled, "but I am willing." The stage fell silent as her name was announced. There were no more chuckles like during her first audition. Now, the entire auditorium held its breath in reverence. "I dreamed a dream in time gone by." Her voice rang out warm, clear, and rich with experience. But unlike the first time this time, Susan didn't sing just for herself. She sang for those who had been forgotten, for dreams cast aside because of age, appearance, or social status. Between verses, the camera panned across the audience. A single father wiped away tears. A young woman stood and clapped mid-performance. A little boy sat silently in his mother's lap, holding a note that read, "Susan made me believe I can sing too." R3. At the judges' table, Simon Cowell never took his eyes off the stage. Amanda Holden clenched her hands into fists for the second time. She wept because of the same woman. When Susan sang the final line, "But life has killed the dream I dreamed," the entire theater rose to its feet. The applause thundered and would not stop. This time, it wasn't out of surprise, but out of deep emotion, respect, and gratitude. Backstage after the performance, Susan didn't rush back to the dressing room. She stepped out into a quieter hallway and sat down on a wooden bench. Closing her eyes, she didn't hear the cameras, didn't think about the results. She thought only this: I did this, not to win, but to feel the light for real. A while later, Simon came over, not with a contract, but with a quiet gaze. He sat beside her and said, "You know, tonight we may have found a winner, but Britain has rediscovered part of its soul because of you." Susan smiled gently. "I don't need to win. I just needed to be heard without judgment." Simon nodded, his eyes reflecting something profoundly human. The results were announced later that night. Susan didn't win the grand prize, but no one remembers who won that year. The entire country and the world remembers just one name: Susan Boyle. A few months later, she released her debut album, I Dreamed a Dream, selling over 10 million copies worldwide, becoming the best-selling debut album by a late-blooming female artist. But more than numbers, Susan received thousands of letters from around the world. Elderly people wrote that they had picked up music again. Children said, "You made me feel more confident in my own voice." And even those trapped in the grind and pain of daily life paused, just to hear her sing. Years later, in an interview, someone asked, "If you could go back to that day, would you do anything differently?" Susan paused for a moment, then shook her head. Because that was the first time in my life I wasn't afraid of my dream anymore." And so, the story of Susan Boyle, the woman who stepped out of the shadows and silenced the world, comes to a close. I hope you enjoyed this story. If you feel it deserves to be shared, please pass it on to your friends. And don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next videos. While you wait for the next journey, I've already chosen a few stories I think you'll love. They're waiting for you right next door. Wishing you a truly wonderful and inspiring day.